All right, let's get started. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Writing Center, and today we're going to be talking about integrative reviews. We are at that point in the semester where people are usually very, very busy, starting to look at what they're going to do for their final assignments, looking at all the things that they've put off that really need to be done now. And, time is getting precious, so we'll try and be as focused as possible today. I should say that this is a paired webinar. We have coming up immediately after this at 7 o'clock, search methodology and role of literature, review of literature matrices. It is designed as a paired thing. We're going to be talking about how to write an integrative review and then showing some of the recommended tools for doing so in the second half. And depending on how many questions we have and a few other factors, you might see some of these things pop up in this presentation as well. That said, if you'd like to download these to follow along, you can use this URL here. I have typed it in the chat window. If you have just joined us after I copied and pasted that and don't see it, just let me know and I'm happy to paste it in there so you can more easily open that. That is a 0PYOJZ. All right, with no further ado, our main focus today here, we're going to start by looking at what exactly is an integrative literature review and why you would want to write one. Now, why you might want to write one could very well be you have an assignment that says, write an integrative lit review. But more than that, more than just you're required to do it for a class, there's a question of what are you trying to accomplish? What are the goals? And hence, what methods will you use to do it? What things will you focus on? And what things will you not focus on? What do you have to document? What don't you have to document? And we'll look at a couple seminal pieces of literature that help distinguish what an integrative literature review is supposed to be and how it's used. We're going to also look at some examples from the literature and those tools I promised. So let's dive in from there. So what is an integrative literature review? Well, you could read a whole article about this, and you'll see me taking some examples from this very article here. Let me let this author speak on this topic. Nurses and midwives may already be familiar with the process of reviewing literature when developing policies and procedures or clinical practice guidelines. An integrative review of research takes this process a step further. It summarizes past research and draws overall conclusions from the body of literature on a particular topic. Now, if you've done an annotated bibliography assignment recently, and I saw on the RSVP list for this webinar that many people who attended that or watched it from the recording and were also signed up for this, you might be thinking, wait, didn't I do that in my annotated bibliography? Well, an annotated bibliography is more a summary of pertinent details from some selection of research that you said is relevant to someone working on a topic. Kind of on the, these are good things to know. But as you can see here, that bolded statement says one of the goals is to draw overall conclusions. And if you were to just draw conclusions on a sample of, say, 5 articles, which is a typical annotated bibliography assignment, that would be a little bit spare on the research side. And even on a larger annotated bibliography, you have to keep in mind an annotated bibliography is a curated list of the most relevant sources that you find. An integrative review aims to be much more detailed and I'm going to say scientific about showing what it did, how you went about doing it, and how you arrived at your conclusions. And those conclusions are a very important part of what makes a good integrative review. Now, you probably have also heard of a systematic review. You may have even seen these terms being used interchangeably, which is something a lot of authors have written about in the last decade, saying, no, these are different things. We should use the terms to only mean this thing or that thing. And don't worry, we'll talk about that more later. So more from the same author. This approach enables inclusion of studies with diverse methods, as well as the theoretical and methodological papers. The body of literature comprises all studies that address related or identical research questions or hypotheses. It can be an arduous task to perform this type of review, depending on the body of knowledge that is available. Now, let's talk about that first sentence there. Inclusion of studies with diverse methods as well as theoretical and methodological papers. Now, if you're talking about what makes a systematic review different from an integrative literature review, systematic reviews tend to focus on experimental studies. The kind of things that are designed to give you, all right, we want concrete data on how did this thing work, or how well did this thing work, which is a good thing and very helpful when you're trying to answer narrow clinical practice questions for which there has been a lot of study. But sometimes you need to draw on more things, whether to sift through a vast body or to deal with conflicting advice or instructions. And that's one of those things that may inspire you to work on an integrative literature review. This is an example of an integrative review summary from Whitehead 2013, Whitehead being the author of those two passages that I read earlier. Let's take a look at this for a moment. Nicholas and Webb 2006 conducted an integrative review to answer their research question, what makes a good wife? A four-stage systematic review process was used, consisting of protocol development, carrying out the search, appraisal and analysis of the papers retrieved, and synthesis of the information. 33 research-based papers were included in the review that used a range of approaches and methods. 8 key concepts were derived from the data: attributes of a midwife, education, research, what a midwife does, care organization, other professionals, partners, and international perspectives. Now, if you haven't guessed already from the spelling on some of the previous examples and the use of the term midwife, this is someone who is writing in the United Kingdom, not here in the United States. But that's not what we're going to focus on here. Look at what they've summarized Nichols and Webb having done. So they were trying to answer a research question, what makes a good midwife? And you'll see from the last sentence, they came up with 8 key concepts from all the data that they looked at. Now, that is not a narrow clinical practice question like, oh, what procedure should we use to reduce errors in this environment? Or what is the most efficacious and effective hand washing practice to use in such and such an environment? This is a broader question of what makes a good midwife. And for that, you have to look at more than just, oh, we looked at 8 studies that just sent out a questionnaire. That's the kind of thing where you do want to ask theoretical and even philosophical questions about, well, how do you balance the parents' interests and the medical needs, its medical responsibilities and liability? And so you do want to look at a broad range of things. And you will see that the summary notes that they not only retrieve this, but they synthesize the information. This is deriving a lot of new meaning from these 33 things that they focused on. Now, there are certainly more than 33 research-based papers about midwives, even back in 2006. So a key part of the review is detailing how they arrived at those 33. And here I'm going to take just a moment to show you something, skipping ahead a little bit, that I find a really great way of summarizing an integrative review. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and I'm going to share my web browser here. And let me know if this is too small for you to read. This is a chart, a flow chart showing the literature search strategy from which these authors arrived at their final 27 studies to review from their initial searches that came up with 758 results. Now, this is as many literature search method sections. this is something of an abstraction, by which I mean it does not show all of the details here, but it does give us a key big picture view of some main things. Like they started out with searching for some terms and they got 758 results from these separate databases. And then they went and looked for duplicates and took those out of their count. And they also read through the titles and the abstracts using their inclusion and exclusion criteria. Now, these will be these were documents in another part in this paper here. But here, again, this is providing the big picture view. So they use this process and removing duplicates to cut down these numbers. And we see we've gone from 758 to, that looks like we have 93. Now, 93 is still a lot, but it's a lot more manageable than 758. And so here they went ahead and they printed out these articles and they read them all. Now, did they read them all in full detail? Probably not. If you have your inclusion and exclusion criteria in hand, you start reading and you realize, oh, my inclusion criteria says this kind of population, they are not doing that. I can put this in the rejection and pile. Now, that is fine. Sometimes there are details that just aren't included in the abstract. But the point is, if you find a reason to exclude something, put that in your rejection pile so you have a much more manageable total. And through this process of reviewing these articles, they winnowed down 93 to a much more manageable 25. And then looking at the reference list, they found some stuff, probably things that were cited a lot, were cited as very important, and added those two in. And thus they arrived at the final 27 that they used in the integrated review. Besides this being a great demonstration of the steps that you should be taking when you are looking at the literature to create an integrative review yourself, it's also a good illustration of the level of detail that you're going to be documenting as you go. Now, there are many ways to do that. You can take screenshots so you can keep track of your search strings. You can paste them into a spreadsheet. I'm going to advocate pasting into a spreadsheet because then it's very easy to track and see where things went, and just old-fashioned writing down notes on the numbers that you get. So here, they came up with 27 there. Awesome. 27 is way more manageable than 758. Let's go back to our slides here. So in general, let's look at what a literature review is designed to do. First of all, you're providing some summaries of relevant literature. It's generally descriptive. You're talking about things, but you're probably not analyzing most of these studies in great detail. And it's not necessarily an analysis of the literature. Now, if you're writing a DNP level literature review, you should absolutely have analysis and synthesis. But there are many other literature reviews that are written more narrowly for concise projects, and it's more, I'm giving you summaries of the most relevant stuff. And that's fine. There are many literature reviews that are basically curated guides for, here's what you should be looking at if you're working in this subject. Generally, the more developed a field is, the more research is going on, the more that people write these concise, targeted lit reviews, where it's more, here's a bunch of summaries versus here's some summaries to inform doing a specific project or a specific task. And you'll find that our assignment set, ACU, for all of our doctoral programs, and I believe all of our master's programs as well, are asking you specifically to do that analysis and synthesis. One thing that you'll find in published literature is that often they do not describe their research methodology, which is to say how they arrived at the pieces that they discuss. That is something that we always want you to be doing. It could be just a couple sentences, could be 2 paragraphs, depending on, is this a short assignment or is this your DNP project or EDD dissertation. But the point is, if you're writing at ACU, you should absolutely be keeping track of how you found and arrived at the things that you studied in detail. In summation, you can think of a lit review as, generally speaking, they're good for gaining background knowledge of a subject, good for starting a good source for starting a reading list. So if you find a lit review about something related to your research topic, great. You start familiarizing yourself with what's being written about it, just to get some info on, okay, what's out there? What don't I have to recreate? But they're generally not considered to be a good source for clinical decision making. Why? Well, first of all, there's usually a bit of lag in between when a lit review is created, when it's published, and of course from when the sources that were reviewed were done. So there's that. But also, the lit review is generally created for a particular purpose, which could be gaining general familiarity, could be for a particular type of research. But unless it's exactly the kind of thing that you're doing, you need to look at what they left out. And then you'd want to go back to the original sources for that. Because if you were writing a lit review, if you were writing a lit review, you have to leave out a lot because there's just not enough space. Many dissertations lit reviews are shorter than longer articles, so no problem. If you just joined us, don't worry. We're going to be talking about this and following up on many of these concepts in the next webinar as well. I do encourage you, if you haven't already, to download the supplemental literature review matrix spreadsheet. That there's a link for that I've just pasted in the chat window. And just a moment. All right, sorry. Let me back up a couple of slides. By the way, I'm going to plug this excellent guide here that's linked at the bottom. It is a really helpful resource that succinctly describes the differences between a couple different genres. All right, so I talked about systematic reviews earlier and said that we're going to be coming back to them. Well, this is that time. A systematic review is a type of literature review that is generally designed to reach a particular conclusion about a topic or issue. They are very often designed to address a specific area of clinical practice and essentially say, okay, we looked at what was published out there on this thing, and we checked the numbers, maybe did a little bit more of analysis of that, and based on the numbers, here's what we should do. And that's fine. It's a great genre. You will see that there are an awful lot of systematic reviews published, because if you're working on something and you find someone's come out with a systematic review on it, it is a huge time saver. And so often when evaluating a new proposed acquisition or a change in procedures, or someone asks in a meeting saying, oh, I heard about this, does this work? What's the first thing you do? You go and look, is there a systematic review about just that thing that you're considering? Now, an integrative review is similar in that it is designed to address some particular issue. But a systematic review tends to focus and sometimes exclusively uses experimental research studies. You know how that goes, where we look at the independent and dependent variables, possibly there's a control there, and that's a great thing. But there are also other types of literature that, because they're not so neatly quantized, not so easily turned into numbers that can be compared, that you may very well want to to consider that wouldn't really fit so well in a systematic review. So what might you be trying to do in a integrative review? Well, you could be reviewing the different theories to explore a different issue. You could be trying to define a concept, look at the evidence for or against something, or look into methodological issues. And because of that, you can include all sorts of research that are not into what in scientific literature, not formally what we would call experimental research. And this can be very broad. It's one of the reasons that integrative reviews are often one of the last assignments that people do for a class, because these can get very big in terms of the amount of things that you say, oh, this is relevant for me to be exploring and discussing here. And that's one of the reasons why in both of these things, your search and selection methodology process should be very precise and clearly described to the reader. What do I mean by clearly described or explicitly described? I mean, someone else should be able to replicate the search that you did. You should tell them the databases that you searched, the keyword searches that you submitted, tell them, were they together, were they separate, were you searching for these in quotes, did you apply a date restriction? If so, what was it? What was the cutoff? Did you stop looking in December 2019? Or did you search all the way up to February 6th, 2019? 2020, I hope, for this year. And I mentioned that many systematic reviews do not delve into analysis of the literature review in great detail. It's more, okay, summary, and then from that summary, we report on this. Well, integrative review, because you're dealing with all these often dissimilar sources, is you really need to analyze it and discuss it, because what may be an obvious difference or a reason for a discrepant result since to someone who's read the whole article will not necessarily be obvious to the reader of your integrative review unless you have that analysis, discussion, and ultimately synthesis written out for the reader of your reader of your integrative review to see. Now, this is a link to the Whitmore text that I read you some excerpts from earlier, and that is a great resource. But at this point, I want to refer you to some recent examples. If you've never gone searching for an integrative review, it's fairly easy. Open up your database search tool, whether this is the ACU OneSearch or Google Scholar. Go ahead and search for your topic and use the term integrative review in quotes. Give us a date range. Are you only looking at stuff since 2016 or 2019? And you should find some examples pretty quickly. I'm going to go ahead and bring up this particular result here because it will show you exactly how I found it. All right, you should now see my web browser share, and you'll see that I have Google Scholar pulled up here. And I went to, in fact, I will just do this from the beginning to illustrate that. So go to scholar.google.com, and I'm searching for integrative review and nursing. And ta-da, we get 73,500 results. Now, obviously, that's a lot. So if I'm writing about my process for my integrative review paper, one of the first things I'm going to need to do is talk about how I cut this down to size. And I could start out just by putting in, all right, I'm going to have a date restriction. Many of you have seen the requirement for recent research. What qualifies as recent research? Well, most professors will say 5 or 6. So if you plan on 5 years from when you expect your dissertation to be published, then that's going to be about right. So here, I'm going to say, I think my dissertation might be finished in 2020, 2021. So I'm going to go ahead and start with 2017 as the cutoff. Now that's still got a lot, so probably want to get more specific here. So let's talk about nursing, training, mentoring. Still a lot. We'll call first year nurses. All right, so we're down to 1,000. Now there are a number of things you could do at this point. We were just doing preliminary searches to figure out what identifies what you're looking for. And you'll see that adding a few more terms starts to make this much more specific very quickly. And if you talk with one of our fabulous research librarians, they can suggest terms. So for example, if I'm searching for first-year nurses who have finished a baccalaureate program, you're not going to necessarily get just that if you type in first-year baccalaureate. You might get freshman students in BSN programs. So what I want are graduate nurses. Well, let's open it up a little bit, but let me try and square that down by putting these terms in quotes. And that starts to collapse that down. Now, if I'm looking specifically at transition, we'll see we narrow that down a bit more. And this is probably a good place to start as, okay, here are the key terms that we had. And is there a particular thing? Oh, hey, if I want to be working in rural programs, well, I think this is a good starting place. So if I'm working on my integrative review, I've, through a couple phrase additions, narrowed this down to 213. Now, remember this flowchart here. If you just loosely draw on a piece of paper what you're doing here, then you can easily track things like added this search term, got these numbers. And then when you go to create a chart like this, then you'll have all those numbers readily available for you. All right, let's look at a couple reviews. In fact, let's look at this one here. So this is a piece called Nurses' Resilience and the Emotional Labor of Nursing Work, an integrative review of empirical literature. So this tells us a couple things right away. We know it's an integrative review, that the focus is on empirical literature. So a lot of the theoretical stuff is probably not going to be discussed here because, as they say in the objective here, their goal is to investigate the state of knowledge on resilience in the context of emotional labor in nursing. And we have a couple starting points here because of this journal format where they add some information that I kind of wish that more papers would. They start with these 2 bullet points on what is already known about the topic. Think of this as the opening sentences of a paper you'd be writing. Without adequate supports, emotional labor can lead to stress and burnout in nurses. Consequently, this can negatively impact nurses' well-being, their job performance, and the quality of their care delivery. Building nurses' resilience through personal and professional development and education can increase their capacity to deal with workplace stress and burnout. And then we have okay, so that was background, but what are you doing specifically? We have this, what this paper adds. This review explores resilience in the context of the emotional labor of nursing work. Emotional labor is, and they define that. And the 3rd bullet point, resilience interventions have been designed to strengthen and build nurses' individual resources and reduce the negative effects of workplace stress. So saying, okay, so people have worked on addressing this problem. And then the last sentence, inclusion of emotional labor mitigating strategies is recommended for future interventions. So we have really 3 big takeaways. First, there's their definition of emotional labor based on what they looked at in the literature. Then they're saying, okay, there are resilience interventions out there, which they describe in more detail below. And then they give their recommendation, which is, here's some emotional labor mitigating strategies that we recommend people use. So this is ultimately addressing a practice problem, but it's doing it in a very organized fashion and with that targeted goal, which really helps in figuring out which details you should be discussing and how you should be analyzing it. By the way, if you are approaching the end of your dissertation or doctoral project writing period, and you are thinking about, well, how might I take my work and adapt it into a journal article for publication, this would not be a bad example to follow. You can see that the way that this particular journal works, they ask for things laid out in this very easy to follow fashion, where some key parts are written more or less as bullet points. And so that's very easy to do, very clear to read. And then you can adapt your information here while presenting things that you've already been gathering while doing your research. Now, this is their own summary of studies. And I'm just going to briefly show you a couple other things of similar focus. So the first one here, I'm going to go ahead and share with you the table that is available in a number of the nursing courses here. So this is a Word document for an evidence-based table describing the literature. And you'll see that it follows a basic set of things. Okay, just paste the citation from whatever you're looking at into one column. Then go ahead and either paste or summarize purpose and question, the type of research design, sample size, variables, what tests they did, so on and so forth. Now, that AACN level of evidence is a key thing that's particular to the more advanced assignments in the DNP program. But the basic principle is the same, just as if you were using, hold on. Too many windows, just a moment. Here we go. This is the literature review matrix file that I have my students use. This is a more detailed thing. If you can't see here, I'm just going to remove some formatting here. So it's easier to see some of these things. And go ahead and, so I know when it's shared, it gets a little bit small. Now, one of the great things I like about using a spreadsheet here, rather than having just a Word doc, is that you can expand and contract these columns as much as you want. Publication year, it's probably not going to need to be too wide. It's just going to be 4 characters. But maybe you want to see the whole list splayed out. And for me, this is an easier thing to do because you can break this down into easy to sort things over time. Perhaps you're looking for a bunch of things that all have the same general sample method or the same general population. You can look at that and easily sort these to match. Let's go ahead and look back at that article though. So you'll see that here they have narrowed what they're including in this table down to just 7 columns. Okay, who wrote it? Where was it published? Now that's important for this particular journal because this is, after all, published in the International Journal of Nursing Studies. So it's got a diverse audience, not all of whom necessarily are interested in what's going on in Taiwan, say. But that's, you can see they've included that in this column here. The aims succinctly described, and this looks like it was a paraphrase of the original text because it's very consistent in how it's worded: to do X, to describe this, to explore, to identify. We've got their notes about the design and the data collection method. I would personally, while keeping my notes, I would use something like the spreadsheet I showed you to put the data collection method in a separate column, because that makes it easier to sort and see, okay, how many semi-structured interviews do I have? How many survey data collections do I have here? And it's not that you can't find that information here, but it just takes a bit longer. Setting in participants. You'll see that they have broken down actually a surprising level of detail here about the population. In this case, 9 female and 1 male. So if you're wondering, well, how might that be generalizable? They do note in the limitations that there may be some issues with that, because while there's certainly a lot of female nurses out there, 9 female, 1 male is a bit harder to say that the male is representative. And you see, one of the great things that looking from this integrative review is that by presenting the summary in this fashion, we find that we can look at it and say, okay, low sample size, low sample size, low sample size, all of whom are female. And then here, one of the reasons to include this Taiwanese study, even though it's a very different culture, and in fact, only from one hospital, look at its sample size compared to the others. So if these happen to align with findings from the other studies of smaller people, it's a good suggestion about the potential generalizability of the other results if they align with this much, much larger sample. And I'll just point out that this is 24 times as large as that first study's population. And then we go down and we see, okay, and you've got the quality score there, which is just in a simple to read star format. Whether you use numbers or whether you use stars, that would probably actually be a matter of the journal preferences and formatting here. The stars is handy because it's just this really quick visual thing that's easy to read and is actually a little easier to follow than just having the numbers written in there, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so you'll see that much of this article, 6 pages of it, about a third of this is that table, which is presenting the results of, okay, here's what we looked at and here are the things we pulled out from it. And then we have the discussion of it. Okay, so here's their method. And they refer to Whitmore and Naffel, which I was reading from earlier and gave you a link on one of the slides. They describe their search strategies, including what terms they looked and how they put them together. Talk about the number that they narrowed down. This is more presenting a breakdown of the different things that they looked at: 4 quantitative, 22 qualitative, 1 mixed method. And they even tell you, they checked the quality using the mixed methods appraisal tool. Which, if you're wondering, how do I know if this is good or not? Well, that is something that they've told you, we use that. So when writing your own integrative review, you could say, I use this tool in alignment with this study with the Galdo et al. 2017. And they describe their analysis process, description of the studies in brief. Now, having put all this information into table 1, they can be really brief because they've given you the core details of what they found above. And now this is talking about more, okay, here are the trends, here are the big picture, here's how it tallied up. And in fact, they have another table here to helpfully summarize the things that were indicated in these different studies. And you see that therapeutic emotional labor, instrumental emotional labor, and collegial emotional labor, there's a lot of that. Now, if you're looking at this for trends, there are a number of different ways you could sort this information here. You'll see that this is sorted alphabetically by the first author's last name. Another way, if you're trying to see, okay, has this changed or has our awareness of it changed, you could also sort that by date and probably start with the newest and go to oldest. And you often notice interesting things with this kind of thing, either because something has popped more to our consciousness, and certainly emotional labor has become part of our parlance more these last 6-10 years than it was when I was in graduate school. And we see that this, we have another table here where they're looking at, okay, well, if those are the types of work, where is it going? And that starts to show you some other interesting patterns here. And so they've got discussion of that. They break down these things. They talk about aspects that they felt was helpful to explore, and talk about the bias that we already noted in looking at their table 1, that most of these participants were female. Another step, which you might do if you're doing the same thing, is to look and see, okay, well, how does that compare to the general nursing population? And which, as we know, tilts towards female. Well, this particular study doesn't delve into that. However, they do talk about how culture affects that, at not looking at how that might affect the recruitment, which would probably be a different integrative review, but they talk about, okay, so looking at those results, how do we find that spread across different cultures? They have this example that I dissect from Iran. Okay, let's go to another one here. So this one is titled, What Do Nurses Need to Practice Effectively in the Hospital Environment? An integrative review with implications for nurse leaders. Now, one of the reasons I like this, besides this author having my name, is that they tell you directly, this is designed to produce information to be used to inform nurse leaders. And we see this abstract is again broken down into these highly specific things. Now, again, if you're working on a dissertation or an integrative review assignment for ACU, usually you'll be writing your abstract in paragraph form. But although this is broken down into these subheadings, it's essentially would flow as a paragraph. And to show that, I'm going to read some of it for you. When staffing legislation was introduced, New Jersey nurse leaders recognized from the research and their years of clinical leadership experience that the work environment is a multidimensional concept and that staffing is not the only variable related to nurse and patient outcomes. Thus, an understanding of what nurses need in their hospital environment to practice nursing effectively was sought. The aim of the study, if we're putting this in paragraph, we'll probably say, the specific aim of the study was to examine the evidence regarding clinical nurses' perception of what they need to practice nursing effectively in the acute care hospital environment. And then they go and say, oh, our methods. Well, since this is the methods for an integrative review, it involves researched these databases as, and this library that we had access to, because there are a variety of different subscriptions available for each of these databases. We searched using this question as our guide here, and they developed some search criteria related to that, and they followed these guidelines, and then we've got the results, including this specific linking evidence to action thing. You won't see this broken down quite so clearly in all the examples, but it's a very helpful thing to have to do and to be able to read. So I encourage you, if you're writing one, to make sure that you produce this text, because wherever it goes, it's good to be able to pinpoint, all right, here is what we did exactly, what we came out with. We identified that there are multiple factors that need to be taken into account besides just having bodies there. And leadership is important. What leadership does, and they specifically talk about the importance of authentic transformational leadership. If you're in our EDD program, you'll know that transformational leadership is a very important and powerful thing that can mitigate many factors, including long hours and poor pay and things like that. But if you're in our nursing program and are not familiar with this term, it is referring to a specific style of leadership and how it engages individuals. So that's basically these two sentences give several specific recommendations keyed to a more detailed section below, where they have this more takeaways. And you'll see here that, again, they have produced a couple tables where they've went and said, okay, so here's an AACN standard. Here are the magnet domains that correspond to that. And here's what we found people saying in the studies that we looked at, what people were saying where it's important. Oh, so AACN says skilled communication is important. Guess what? It is, and people are calling it respect and teamwork in the literature, and so on and so forth through these. At this point, I think we need to wrap up because we're going to shift gears for our following webinar. Are there any questions or anything that people would like me to talk about in more detail in the remaining minutes we have before the next group of people join us? All right, well, before I pause the recording, let us look at one more thing here. So this is a much cited article that you saw referenced earlier, the Integrative Review, Updated Methodology by Robin Whitmore and Kathleen Naffel. Now, these are two very frequently cited and very influential authors. You'll see their names coming up in your reading and more things than one. And you'll see that, again, it's broken down in this very specific way. And this article talks you through the process of, okay, here's what an integrative review is supposed to do, and here's how it's generally done. Here's how we recommend doing it, and how you accommodate various things that can come up. So they emphasize the importance of clearly identifying the problem that the review is addressing, and there should always be a problem there, as well as the purpose. So besides that general problem, what are you hoping to do? Someone asked a question, how many articles do you need in an integrative review? And I would say the more narrowly that you define your integrative review, the fewer that you have to. Now, it's going to depend on, are you writing your integrative review as an assignment? Or are you writing this as, this is basically a stepping stone to your literature review chapter for your DNP project? And if the person who asked that question provides a little bit more detail, I can certainly try and speak more specifically to that. I would say that in a integrative review that you are writing for your basically, if you're writing your literature review chapter as an integrative review, you're going to want to have at least 25 core sources. Now, that's just talking about the core part where you're looking at, all right, so here are these people writing about this thing. And now you'll have other things because, of course, you'll have to talk about your theory and why you choose your methodology and stuff like that. But the core part where you're really delving in and saying, okay, here we're comparing things, you want to have that kind of number for saturation. And if it's not available, to either widen your search scope, so you're looking at a wider date range, or explain to the reader that this simply is not available and why. And that's one of the reasons why you want to describe your search process here. I'm going to jump through, let's see. I think there was something either in this article or in one of the others that I have up that speaks to those numbers. So give me just a moment to find the reference I'm looking for. All right, so here's a specific guideline. And ideally, all of the relevant literature on the problem or topic of interest is included in the review. Now, again, I said, depending on how narrowly you define this, if the purpose of your lit review is to deal with conditions after the passage of the Affordable Care Act, of course, that's a date restriction that you can put on and say, all right, so we're not looking at things before because this changed healthcare so fundamentally, okay, and then narrow that down. Now, you might do that process and come up with only 15 results. But if you've documented your search process and your literature search methods and you say, we looked for this, there are this many, but as soon as we put in that post-Affordable Care Act thing and limited it geographically to studies in the United States, there were only 15. Well, you've just demonstrated, okay, we are actually being comprehensive. It just happens that the way that we're looking at this, the problem that we're looking at, there are only 15 that we were able to find, and we looked in this place, and we looked in that place, and we looked in that place. And if you do that, and there are only 15, sure, then 15 is 100% of what there is meeting those criteria. I would say you would probably, if you're only coming up with 15, then be going and doing some look at stuff before the passage of the Affordable Care Act, so that you have a basis of saying, well, is this continuing or diverging from previous practices and trends? But the main focus, the part that you'd be producing those tables on and that search diagram, yeah, if it's only 15, then that's what you come up with. One of the reasons you submit these drafts for feedback and you write what becomes your lit review chapter and stages is because sometimes people will really get crazy on narrowing down too much, and they'll come up with, oh, there are like 4 articles on this, in which case your faculty committee will gently tell you, you should widen that focus, as this is really too narrow, or it's too narrow as is to be the kind of doctor of nursing practice project that you want it to be. So I hope that's helpful. I'm going to stop the recording now. If you, the person who asked that question, or anyone else in the room has any further questions, please feel free to ask, because I can check those before we start the next presentation.